Welcome to the Mental Advantage Podcast. Whether you're an athlete trying to perform at your best when it counts the most, a coach or business leader trying to get more out of your team, or someone looking for more personal growth, this is the place for you. This podcast is your map to guide you to the right mindset, systems, and strategies you need to become the best version of yourself. And now, here's John Cullen and Brandon Allen.
All right, welcome in to this week. We have a really good guest. I know I say that every week, like one of these times where I'm going to be like, you know what, the guest is so-so, but y'all can tune off now if you like. It's like, no, but we've been fortunate actually with a lot of the guests that we've had. But Jay Stewart, as we mentioned on Tuesday's show, it was highly recommended by Aaron Goodson, who you all remember from Mississippi State. And Aaron and Jay went back into the college days where both of them were at West Virginia University together. And I think if I did the math correct, as far as the years that Jay was there, that he would have overlapped some with Dana Charbonneau as well. So kind of have a little bit of a WVU connection there.
Shocking. That would happen.
Yeah, shocking. It's like having the Reds mental skills guy on the show.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's funny how that works itself out. But Jay is somebody who has worked with, he's been doing this for over a decade, into the sports psychology piece, performance piece, works with tactical athletes, been supporting a variety of performers and athletes, for, like I said, over almost a decade now. Real passionate about helping people, perform at their highest level, like so many of our guests are. So really looking forward to that conversation.
Absolutely. It's going to be interesting too, for our listeners, because we have talked to a couple of folks, that are on the tactical athlete side, and just so the listeners know, when we say that, we're talking about the men and women that are in our military, and so it's interesting to hear Jay talk about the consequences of you walk off the field when you are playing a sport. You may not when you are in battle. So, it brings a whole different set of consequences and what you have to do in terms of your mental resiliency, your mental flexibility, and your emotional flexibility too. So looking forward to the conversation with Jay.
Absolutely. And it's a great point you bring up, because I think it's appropriate moving into Memorial Day weekend to be talking about that, because it is true. There's a lot of men and women who've served this country and gave the ultimate price for our freedom. So we would be remiss not to thank them, on behalf of the podcast. It's a great respect that both Brandon and I have for all of you who've served, and especially those who've, given that ultimate sacrifice. There's no words that can describe how thankful and grateful we are for you and your family.
And the families too, right?
Yep,
I mean, that's the thing.
Absolutely.
Is just the sacrifice for, the country, the freedoms that we are provided off of their sacrifice is not. It's definitely not lost on you and I. And I certainly wish, without going too far down the rabbit hole, I certainly wish, that it's something that the nation and specifically kind of the people that are putting narratives out there in the media that would realize, like, we're all in this together. And so, to your point, certainly appreciative of all the sacrifice.
Absolutely. So we will get into a lot of those topics with Jay Stewart, as well as the difference between mental toughness and resilience. And I think you guys will really enjoy this conversation. And he'll even give you some tips on how to overcome that fear that we all have. And so I think it's going to be a really enjoyable conversation. I know we enjoyed being a part of it. So thank you guys for listening, and we'll talk to you next week. All right, Brandon, we are excited to have with us this week is Jay Stewart. So some of you may remember when Brandon and I had our show at the beginning of this week, we talked about Aaron Goodson had, kind of tipped us off to Jay. That's the thing that we have found is that it's such a small community. A lot of folks that are involved in sports psychology, mental performance, whether it's at the colleges or in all walks of life. There's a unity there. There's a camaraderie. And so it just so happens that actually Aaron, who had some of his history at West Virginia University, is kind of overlapped with Jay Stewart. So we're going to welcome Jay to the show now. Jay, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let me tell everybody, the listeners, a little bit about you. So Jay's a performance expert with tactical athletes. He's helped them reach and maintain high levels of performance under challenging circumstances. You kind of think about Andy Reese a little bit, Brandon, when we think about Jay, because Andy has kind of that similar background in working with some military and tactical athletes. Jay's also been supporting a variety of performers and athletes utilizing mental performance skills for almost a decade. He's passionate about helping people perform at their highest level, regardless of circumstances. One of the things I chuckled about was when I was kind of in communication with Jay prior to the show and was saying, hey, what are some things we'd like to unpack on the show? He said, we can talk about anything from mental performance to baking. So that might be show number 2, Jay, is finding out what your recipes
no, hold
are.
on a second. Time out. No. We're not burying the lead. All right, Jay. All right, you ready? First, this is a softball question, but you got to show up with one dish to make that first impression. What you baking?
Oh, sourdough bread.
Oh,
ooh, yeah.
Okay.
So that was
you have your own
quarantine.
starter?
I do. That was my quarantine hobby. It took an extended period of time. We'll just say that for me to get it figured out. But yeah, if I got to bake one thing to make an impression, I'm bringing some sourdough bread.
And did you get your starter from anybody, or did you make it?
Flour and water.
Man, did you put like the dried potato and all that stuff?
No, so that might have helped it go a little faster. I think it took me about a month to get a usable starter, which is a longer than it should have. But hey, we're here now, right?
We're here, and we're not going to talk about sourdough bread.
Man, I'm not even so sure I know you anymore. I'm like, starter, what are you talking about?
Hey, listen, and since he's in Columbus, he's already invited to the tailgate for the first Auburn game. So you bring that sourdough and come on down.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, my man, your fellow Georgia resident is going to be bringing pound cake, because that was Brandon's go-to. He can now, and I've tasted that pound cake. It is definitely worth having. So you guys could kind of have like a little Great American Bake Off thing going if you wanted to.
Nothing like two mental guys talking about baking at a football game.
That's right. Yeah. You guys are going to start your own podcast about baking with Brandon and Jay. I could see it now. So Jay, tell me a little bit about your journey, kind of as you were coming up, grew up in Florida, just outside of Orlando. How did you end up, you went to the University of Florida for undergrad, Georgia Southern. Then tell me a little bit about, what got you to where you are today from a journey standpoint.
Yeah. So really kind of by chance, right? Like, it seems like that's how a lot of journeys start. I was an engineering major, aerospace engineering, changed my major to psychology, and beginning of my junior year of undergrad, helping one of my roommates move in, and he had an open box, and there was a sports psych textbook, right? The like Weinberg and Gould, the one that I think probably a lot of people are familiar with. And I thought that looks cool. And so took sports psych as an elective at Florida, and that led me to Georgia Southern. And then Dr. Harris, Brandon Harris, at Georgia Southern was a WVU alum and didn't have a bad thing to say about it. So I applied, and it was the only school I finished the application to, and fortunately, that's all I needed.
Nice. That's awesome. That's awesome. So was there something about your history prior to finding that book? I mean, were you, I take it you were an athlete growing up, you played some sports. I mean, what was the kind of trigger point for you that said, oh, that would be something I would definitely be interested in?
Yeah, so I never actually played organized sports. Loved playing like backyard sports, pickup sports. I just never really got into the organized sports. Really enjoyed doing it for fun. And I really enjoyed learning about psychology. I think probably a lot of people might be disappointed in me saying this, but general psych was the first time I like read a textbook, which is probably a good sign that engineering wasn't for me, right? Yeah, I just really enjoyed it. I don't know. I think kind of like, peeling back the onion, getting under the surface a little bit to try to figure out what's going on. And you do that with words instead of numbers, I guess. So,
yeah. Well, it's interesting. We've talked a lot to the guests about the fact that you're starting to see more and more of the, kind of discipline of sports psychology and mental performance coaching. It's become this thing where a lot of people are, there's, it seems like you can throw a rock in any direction anymore and find a mental performance coach, or at least somebody who's been trained in some discipline of mental performance coaching. Is that something that, you kind of look at now and you think, okay, I really enjoy as you started to get working with tactical athletes and the regular athletes? Have you found that there are certain, certain maybe pain points that is common amongst both the tactical and the regular athletes?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like this connects back to your previous question too. It's sports psych skills aren't just for sports, right? So like we talk about sports psych skills, but if you're working on building confidence, the same skills that you might use to have more confidence firing a weapon for the first time could help you, like playing a live basketball game for the first time could help you baking sourdough bread for the first time, right? And so it's like you're using these skills and you may hone them in a sport or in a tactical environment, but developing those skills are going to help you transfer to other domains of life, hopefully, right? Like ideally, that's what happens. So yeah, tactical athletes are people and athletes are people. And so I think you kind of losing kind of sight of that would cause you to maybe miss opportunities to help and apply the skills.
I think it's an interesting point because, one of the things, and I know you and I have talked a little bit about this as far as mindfulness and just this idea of staying present in the moment, right? And that's something that no matter what the kind of area you're in, whether it's athletics, whether it's in business, like you said, baking, whatever the case may be, the idea of just being in the moment, being where you are when you're supposed to be there is so important. How have you been working with your clients to kind of develop that idea of just being more mindful?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's really varied. So I think there are definitely times working with clients where they're more, I think, open to kind of that idea of mindfulness and being mindful, and the terminology mindfulness doesn't like turn them off, I guess. Right? And so you can talk about being in the present moment and like open to what you're supposed to be doing or whatever is going on. And then I think there are times where you kind of maybe blend some CBT language in there a little bit, and it's all right, like let's focus on what you're thinking and the task at hand here, right? And like what really matters right now, and trying to guide them in that way. And so you kind of like, maybe it's like a little ninja move to try to use the language that they're going to be open and receptive to.
That's really interesting. We talk about this a good bit, where you talk about openness, Jay, and do you find it challenging at times to have a tactical athlete or just an athlete? Are they open to the mental performance thing. We know it at certain schools. We've talked to Dr. Goodson, Dr. Charbonneau, to several, and there's still some stigma sometimes to it. But it really does seem in certain fields, I would certainly think on the tactical side, that mental health has become such a huge area of importance that that the willingness and openness there is certainly better than it was, say, 5 to 10 years ago.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, I couldn't imagine being out in this environment like 10 years ago and being on the props to those people for sticking through with what they've been doing. But I think to more directly answer your question, I think openness has a lot to do with past experience. And so, there are times, whether it's athletes or tactical athletes, you're talking to them and it's like, this was the way it was explained to me. Right. And you hear that and you think, why would someone say that? Right. Like, why is that the avenue or approach that they chose? Or it was just done in a way where it was kind of like forced on them. Right. And like in general, I don't think humans like being told you're going to do this whether you want to or not. Right. So taking away that autonomy can kind of turn people off, and it's not necessarily like their fault, right? Or the skills fault or the stigma as much sometimes as it is like, I had this experience where my autonomy was taken away. And so I don't know where to direct my, dislike other than towards the reason why. And that
especially for alpha individuals, right? I mean, most of these athletes are typically leaders. And to be told what to do can sometimes, be a detriment.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, I think like as a practitioner, keeping that in mind and saying like, okay, cool. So tell me what you know and what's your experience. And like, I think oftentimes giving people an opportunity to voice their experience or their thoughts or what they know can kind of help take some of that closed offness, I guess, away, that guardedness off. And then like they become more open, I think, in those instances.
I think that one of the things that strikes me as you start to compare those two realms, the traditional athlete versus the tactical, or not even versus, because to your point, there's a lot of similarities there. I would say that both, and this kind of goes with what Brandon's saying there about, alphas, is that there's a high tendency to be very results focused because there's a tendency to want to be the best at whatever it is. And that's the biggest challenge we have with working with athletes, whether that be tactical or the traditional athlete, is they want to be so focused on the outcomes that a lot of times they don't allow themselves. And it kind of goes back to a little bit to that mindfulness piece, but it's specifically not being process oriented. And I would imagine that when you're dealing with military folks in general, that process orientation is probably even greater need for that than even in some of the other, whether it's working with a basketball player or a football player or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's drawn me to this population and held me here maybe a little bit longer than I thought I might be is the stakes are higher. Right? Like you miss a shot and it's a basketball, or you miss a golf putt or something. It's like you go on. Typically, you walk away from that. But if there's someone returning those shots, it's different, right? It's different. So the stakes are higher, and I think that brings. It's kind of surreal sometimes to think about, right? Like this is potentially what they're training for, right?
Yeah. Yeah, Brandon brought up on the last show, he was talking about courage, and that, we were getting into this whole idea about being in touch with emotions, because that was something that we talked about with Dr. Charbonneau. And, he was saying like, a lot of people mistake courage for, they're just kind of passing through this. Courage is when you're still scared or anxious about something, but you're just finding a way to kind of push through that. And I think that's really one of the things, if you start thinking about the people that you're dealing with, there's all sorts of emotions that you're probably having to help them work through, anxiety, fear, whatever the case may be. And it made me think about something, is this difference between and Brandon and I started to unpack this a little bit in the last show, but it's difference between mental toughness and resilience. Like where do you kind of land in that? Like, I think those two things get interlinked sometimes, but I don't think that they necessarily should be.
Yeah, no, for me, they're different. They're both valuable traits, or not traits, like valuable skills to develop. So they're not fixed. They can be developed and they can go away too, I think. But I think of mental toughness more as the ability to get through a challenging situation, which can look different, right? Like a cactus is pretty mentally tough, but so is a rock, right?
Right.
And then resilience is the ability to not just get, maybe you have the mental toughness to get through, and then resilience is what helps you rebound on the other side.
Yes.
And so it's not just about, resilience isn't just about getting through the experience, but what are you taking away once you get through the experience, right? Getting back at least to baseline.
I love what you just said there, because that's something that we haven't, I don't know that we've addressed that yet, John, is the resiliency piece, right? The bounce back piece of whether it's a success or a learning opportunity, right? But you see people, former Navy SEALs like the Gogginses and the Willinks and those guys that are clearly mentally tough, clearly have the resiliency to draw from those experiences what's needed, but also has kind of that the mental flexibility that like Dr. Charbonneau talked about, where, hey, no one's saying this isn't a tough situation. No one's saying that I'm not in touch with what's going on in my surroundings. I'm just saying, here's how I'm going to get through it, and here's what I'm going to learn from, right? And ultimately take responsibility for my actions and the outcome of whatever the pieces that I could control that I did, right? And so I think part of that is also the responsibility piece, right?
Yeah. No, like, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jay.
No, 100%. I mean, I think I've had this conversation with a few colleagues over the years. Like, you have to have that level of self-awareness and ownership to get over, through, bounce back, however you want to describe it. Right? Like that ability to, or willingness, the openness, kind of coming back to say like, okay, yeah, this is what I contributed. And like, this is what I can do moving forward. This is what I can control. This is what I can't control. And if you're not aware of yourself or the situation or of others, it makes that ownership really hard.
Well, and I think you talked about it, that the ability to develop it. It's all keeping with that growth mindset. You can work on both aspects of this, the mental toughness part and the resilience part. I read an article recently that was talking about this, and there was an American psychologist, Suzanne Kabasa. I don't know if that name rings a bell or anything, but she was looking at resilient managers and found that some responded differently to stress, pressure, and challenge than others, although all sought to be resilient. And she said she found that some adopted a positive approach to adversity and challenge, sometimes even seeking it out. Like it was something that they seeking out that challenge, right? Because that's going to be able to help develop it. But here's something she said I thought was really interesting. She said, resilience and mental toughness are related. Most, if not all, mentally tough individuals are resilient, but not all resilient individuals are mentally tough, which I thought was a really interesting thing there. What do you think she meant by that?
Yeah, interesting. So I think, in a general definition, or generally referring to resilience, you've survived something. You've gone through the stress of the challenges, right? And so like, I think to make it through to the other side, there's some implied level of mental toughness to even be in a position to bounce back, right? Like,
right.
You could be mentally tough and be in a challenging situation and stay at the bottom, right? Yeah. But I think in resilience, there's some coming back to the surface at a minimum. And so I would guess that's kind of what she's meaning, right? Where like some people can withstand a lot, and maybe don't necessarily bounce back to where they were before. Whereas if you're resilient, you also possess some level of mental toughness as well.
That mental elasticity, right? That rubber band, right? That can snap back versus the one that got stretched out and survived, but it just never comes back.
Maybe.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating article. Like, I'm gonna have to look that up now. I think.
I'll send it to you. It to you. I mean, it's pretty simple. Title is "What's the difference between resilience and mental toughness?" But it had some interesting concepts in there, thoughts around that. One of the things, and I think Brandon was just talking about that, is the elasticity. Is I'm curious, how do you work with this? How do you help develop this idea of resilience in some of the tactical athletes that you work with? Because I know when we had Andy Reese, I mentioned this on earlier in the introduction on the show, they have that deliberate discomfort, and it's all about getting people outside of their comfort zone. So what are some things that you've done in the past to help people develop that resilience?
Yeah. I like the idea of getting people outside of their comfort zone, or not necessarily being like, hey, you're outside of your comfort zone. Like, come hang out with me and we'll get back in your comfort zone, right? Like, no. But we got to make sure that they have at least an opportunity to develop the skills that can help them be resilient coming out of that discomfort, right? And so I think for me, that's spend a lot of time focusing on like what are the skills and how can we not just talk to them about them, but give them opportunities to actually apply those skills, right? And to like get their hands dirty and get in the weeds. It doesn't take a lot for psychology or sports psych to become very conceptual, right? Like it can get out here real easy, and so like let's bring it down to earth, and like let's build something with our hands.
Yeah, it's interesting because Andy on the show said that, he talked about combat being the best test of mental toughness. So thinking about that, idea of mental toughness. So for you, I think a lot of times it's probably just getting them to overcome certain things, certain emotions, if you will, that come up in them. So being in that discomfort arena, there, whether that's going to be stress that comes up, whether it's going to be fear that comes up, whatever the case would be. But if they can get past it now in at least somewhat of a controlled environment, to your point earlier, when the stakes are even higher and it means something, and there's the bullets are flying, so to speak, it's going to be really important that they are able to overcome some of those emotions as they're coming through.
Yeah. And I think I think to some extent probably overcoming, but I'm forgetting the doctor's name. It's going to bother me. There's a TED Talk. It's essentially being brilliant every day or something like that, where the speaker talks about how emotions are energy in motion, right? And so your emotions are driving some energy or some behavior, right? And so I think for me, it's like, maybe overcoming some emotions sometimes, but I think sometimes it's finding the right emotions or how to use the emotions that you're having. And so like, if anger is going to help you perform better, then how can we use it? Right? Mm-hmm. Like, how can we channel that anger? If anger is not going to help you when you have to go back to performing, like, I'm not going to tell you to not be angry now, right? Like if you just failed something and you're angry, that probably means you care. Right. So let's take this time. Like, if you need to be angry, that's fine. But when it's time to, get back up on the platform and perform, then what are we going to do? Right? Like, if anger is not going to help you perform that task, what emotion is? And so then let's develop strategies or talk about strategies to work on to have the energy and motion that you need to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish.
So that's Dr. Alan Watkins, by the way.
Yes, yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Here's what I think is really interesting about what you just said, Jay, is the almost like mental judo, right? Where you're going to use that energy of whatever that emotion is to your advantage, right? Like being able to to wrestle it to the point to where, hey, I can actually use this to my advantage. And sometimes that can be very difficult, especially in situations like you just said, to where, and John, I think you were kind of alluding to it, how do you get someone to a point to where they're angry enough that you can take what, like you said, Jay, like, let's build something with our hands. How do you get them to a point to where you're now actually applying the techniques that you've taught them? I mean, those can be very challenging, right? I mean, because it requires almost some poking and prodding intentionally to get them angry or whatever that emotional component is, I guess.
Yeah, I think fortunately I haven't had to poke or prod to make anyone angry yet. I haven't,
especially some of the folks you're dealing with.
Like I think, think about sports like in general, right? Like, I don't know y'all's experience, but mine's been like, will you help with this? We're having this difficulty. Right? Like, It's not like we get called too often when everyone's clicking. And it's like, how can we maintain this, right?
Right.
So, typically they've already experienced something that's annoyed them or frustrated them. And so like that works out. But no, I think to get to your question, it depends a little bit on the environment. There's been times where I haven't hesitated to pull another person in if it's a group thing, like they're just walking by. I'm like, hey, what have you done that's helped you from the skills that we've taught? And they're like, oh, I used this skill that y'all covered yesterday and it helped my performance. And then so it's like, okay, so I'm not alone. Right, like I wouldn't be alone in using this skill.
Gotcha.
And so I think that helps. I think that helps with stigma a little bit, and even potential vulnerability. Right, like, to say like I needed something extra beyond what I was being taught, when in reality, everyone does.
Right.
So I think doing that has been helpful, or doing different like activities in the moment to kind of help distract if we need to distract. So I handed an athlete a rock one time and I said, hang on to this. This is your anger rock. And when you're ready to go perform and you want to be more confident, you set the anger rock down, right? And then you perform. And then if you want to be angry when you're done performing, you can pick that rock back up and you can carry it around. But like when you're holding on to that rock, would that impact your ability to perform? And they're like, yeah. Okay. And so like, let's set it down. And let's talk about, writing down some of your accomplishments that you've had to help get some confidence back. Or let's talk about some strategies to drop the failure so that you can get back to the task at hand, or whatever, sports psych skill we went to in that moment.
Well, and what's good about that, Jay, is you're teaching them how to manage it and not to set it aside or push it away, and that's one of the things that I think oftentimes people, especially when they're dealing with athletes that are going to be angry, is, they try to get them to stop their thinking or stop their mind. And that's impossible. I mean, the mind's always going to be moving and you're always going to have different thoughts and different emotions and feelings come up. It's about dealing with them and being able to still be efficient at what you're trying to do in spite of those emotions and feelings that you're having. And that's a really key element you just said is, hey, you can set this aside and put it down for a minute and then go and execute what you need to execute and then pick that back up. Because there's a lot of athletes that sometimes say, and you hear this, especially I work with a lot of college athletes, and they'll say, oh, I play better when I'm angry. And I'm like, well, let's talk about that, right? Because that's not necessarily, like, I think you may be confusing some components in there.
Yeah. And I think there are some tasks where sure, right? Like, you're going for a PR on a deadlift, like, all right. Like let's see a little more energy in there, right? But you're doing a fine motor task. I'm not going to tell you how to live your life, but I don't know if anger is the best way to approach that.
Yeah. I mean, I tell them, I'm like, anytime you're focused on, you can't focus on two things at one time. So anytime you're focused on another emotion, anything that's going to conflict what your task is, like you said, it's going to be important.
But I think it kind of goes back to like we've talked about before. Sometimes that's an athlete not really knowing how to communicate properly, right? Because it's not that they perform better angry. They sometimes will perform better with aggression, right? And they look at anger as being this catalyst for aggression. But what I think I heard you say, Jay, is that let's talk about how do we use that to get a result that you're looking for, but understand that emotion is not something that you have to carry around with you on a day-to-day basis to perform the way that you want to perform.
100%, 100%. And I think, I mean, even someone that, like, as much time as I've spent in school, my vocabulary oftentimes feels like inadequate. And so it's like, and I've studied this stuff. So I think communication is a big thing. And just being able to describe, what it is that you're experiencing, you're feeling. I don't have emotions. Like, well, you're a human being. So like, let's work on being more aware of our emotions, right? And like what's actually going on. I think oftentimes people say aggression as well, and they're talking about maybe being more assertive. And so it's like throwing a deep pass downfield. I don't like, that's an assertive play call, right? Like, I don't know if I would say that's being aggressive in that moment. And so it's like, what's going to help you be assertive?
Right. It's being committed, right? Yeah. It may not be aggressive, but I'm going to be committed to that, right? I mean, that's there. And again, big difference between commitment and aggression.
Yep. No, good stuff there. So let's move on. And there's something else that I know that we had talked about, wanting to talk about this. You had mentioned, diving in. One of the things you dive into in your practice is the role of our values and beliefs on life and performance. And I was just curious about that. There was an old saying, and I can't remember the UFC fighter. I want to say it's St. George was his last name, but is that a man's driven by principle, a boy is driven by preference. And it was this idea, talking about how important values and beliefs are. And I think in our world, in the business world, we talk about it as motivational fit. Are the things that you hold dear to you present in the tasks that you're doing? What do you unpack? Tell me a little bit more about this idea of values and beliefs and how they impact life and performance.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think a lot of times there are things that happen where we might be, we keep going back to anger and frustration, right? You might be frustrated, you might be annoyed, you might, or you might feel the opposite, right? Like you might know, like, hey, this is great. And sometimes we don't know why. And so working on understanding, some of those values and beliefs that are impacting how we're interpreting the situation, which is impacting how we're feeling about the situation. And then ultimately, the actions and behaviors that we take. And so values and beliefs can be good. They can be confusing. They can be on the top of our mind. We can know them, right? Like people should do A, B, and C. Or they could be operating under the surface and they're kind of like operating in the shadows and we don't even know that they're impacting, what we're seeing and what we're taking in and what we're weighing and not weighing. And so, I think working to just build more awareness again, starting there and having conversations about values and beliefs are a thing. And sometimes you know them and sometimes you don't.
Well, and I think one of the things that are so important, and you just touched on it, is it's because they usually lead to some other emotion, some other thing, right? It's because you feel a certain way or you feel strongly, those core beliefs. That's what I always tell athletes. Core beliefs, meaning these are things that are to your core. And if you have those underlying, even sometimes beliefs and values that are there, it can, to your point, ultimately lead to other emotions when they come up. And so it's going to be important to kind of peel back that whole layer. And we talked about that with Dana Charbonneau, was the idea that so much now in sports psychology, and you're probably dealing with this with athletes you work with, or even with the tactical athletes, is finding out that there's that clinical piece to it, that where that psychology piece comes in, and then there's that mental performance. And sometimes where in the past we would keep them on each end of the spectrum, now there's a molding of the two things. And now you're starting to, and that I think gets into some of those values and beliefs discussions, is what is it that's preventing this, or maybe as a barrier to this mental performance, that we still have to just unpeel another layer to find out. And maybe it is something deeper than that.
Yeah, and I think that makes it kind of tricky sometimes too, as like sports psych practitioners, is making sure we stay in our lane. And so it's like having conversations, and it's like, okay, so we're getting a gray area here. So like, let's move back to the area that we know.
That's right.
And I know
we don't need the couch. That's right.
Right? There's referrals. Like, I'd be happy to walk you somewhere if you want to continue going that direction. But yeah, no, I mean, humans aren't like robots. We don't operate in silos. And so I think it's maybe short-sighted. I don't know if that's a word, but let's go with it. Short-sighted to think that like only sport experiences impact sport, and only family experiences impact family experiences, and only leisure experiences impact leisure experiences. Because like the reality is all of those things impact who we are. And like, you don't just leave that behind, right? You can work on compartmentalizing and having effective ways to open up, those compartments when it's the right time. But the reality is like they're all connected in some way. And so to ignore those connections is to ignore part of what makes people who they are.
Yeah. Is there, when we were talking about that difference between, the tactical athletes and the regular athletes earlier, and we said, look, at the end of the day, they're both humans, and you're dealing with a lot of similarities there. Are there differences though? I mean, as far as like from a perspective of pain points, for example, are there certain things that you find come up a lot more when you're dealing with military folks than say when you're dealing with that traditional, baseball, basketball, football player?
I would say kind of surprisingly, no.
Okay.
I think maybe sometimes how it gets displayed, or maybe the language that's used around those points may be a little different. But at least in my experience, I would say no. Some conversations might happen slightly more frequently, right? Like in different environments. But in terms of there being like, this is something that happens or that I've seen in tactical athletes that like I haven't seen in athletes or vice versa. No, I'd say, yeah, it's pretty similar.
Well, I would think too, because you are trying to, regardless of the type of athlete, there's always an outcome, right? It's the E plus R equals O, right? I mean, each of those have that equation, right? There's always an outcome that you're trying to dissect on, what was the event and what was my reaction, and trying to hone those skills. So I mean, and it's a really good question. I do think I could see where that's a very common thread though, between multiple athletes or those types of athletes for sure.
Yeah. And I think, I know for me, like prior sport experience has actually been like a really valuable experience to be talking to someone that has. So, like if you had a challenging moment when you first started playing like football or basketball or whatever it might have been, what are some of the things that maybe helped you overcome that? Or team dynamics, right? Like teams accomplish more. And so that may be something that, like in a tactical athlete population, team dynamics are hugely important. If you're working with someone that competes in an individual sport, like those may not be conversations that happen as often. But they're still there. I think the biggest difference, the biggest point is consequences, right? Like it's consequences,
absolutely.
What's going to happen. If you don't meet the standard, then maybe you have to like recycle a school and you do that school over again or a section of the school. And that section is a couple of weeks, right? And it's not like something that you can say, I'll come back to that later. I'll try for a starting position next spring. It's kind of like, sometimes it's you go now or you don't go back, right? And so sometimes those consequences are a little heavier, and so then the sacrifices that people make might be a little bit different.
Well, and I imagine, Jay, that it gets a little bit trickier, a little bit more, as you start to get, you're dealing with, say, that military, that tactical athlete that's getting ready for deployment, who's really close, versus the one who is just going out and doing drills on the base, right? Like, I mean, there's a complete difference in the way that those two individuals are handling, or their focus, what their focus is on, because it's one thing to practice in a controlled environment when we're just on the base or we're out there somewhere on the drill field versus, hey, next week we're going to be this. It's real. Like this thing is getting ready to get real. So that's a whole different mindset that I'm sure you're having to deal with there.
And completely different, right? Like thinking about life cycle of an athlete or of a student. Soldiers have, different life cycles as well. And so they may go to their OSIT or their basic training, right? And then their individual job training. And then they get to their unit. And so those experiences are going to be different. And then the mindset of a training mindset versus like a going to perform essentially mindset. And so, yeah, definitely different environment, different situations, different risk factors. There's some transfer. And so like ideally you're developing skills in not the combat situations so that you
right.
Because those are life skills, right? I mean, those are things that are going to carry you on. I mean, that's the beauty of whether you're in the military, whether you're in athletics, there are certain common strengths that you develop over a period of time, skill sets, if you will, that are going to help you become a better business person, a better father, a better mother, whatever the case may be. And I think it's not missing those opportunities. So, Brandon, you had something?
I was just going to say, just like a book, right? You've got different chapters of your life. So what you're kind of describing, John, is, in my opinion, are these different chapters that someone may be in. And to your point, Jay, whether it's a chapter or life cycle or whatever it is, right, that there are some commonalities that you're constantly pulling from to try to leverage to your benefit, right? I mean, it's just...
So Jay, Brandon and I started a conversation the other day on this show that we said, you know what, this is going to be a really good topic of conversation when we get Dr. Stewart on. So let's talk about this fear of failure versus fear of success that holds athletes back. So we were talking about this, and I think I'm forcing this segue, but for the sake of time, I'll go ahead and take that liberty to do that. But I do think it kind of started to lead into, as you start thinking about those tactical athletes and some of the things they're preparing for, I would imagine fear does become a very big thing. And it also the outcome focus, right? As we talked about earlier. So do you find that I'm trying to think of the best way to ask this question, that most of the time, the fear that's holding athletes back is a failure or success, or is it really just kind of depend on what's going on?
Oh, I hate that I'm about to say it depends, but I probably think more often we hear stories about fear of failure.
Yeah.
Especially if you're getting in environments where you're going to be uncomfortable, right? Like you're afraid of heights. Guess what? Like you're going up there and
you're going to fight.
People typically aren't afraid of successfully getting down the tower, right? They're afraid of what happens when you don't. So yes, I think, most often I end up talking with individuals that are experiencing fear of failure. Fear of success, I think sometimes does play. Maybe not fear as much as getting caught up in like unexpected success.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't expect to be in a position to get this score. And then all of a sudden they start thinking about, oh my gosh, I'm going to get the score. And then they're not thinking about what they were doing that was getting them the success in the first place.
So I've done some more thinking about this, John, since our conversation. I agree with you, Dr. Stewart. I think what's interesting and something that I thought about is sometimes that fear of success, though, is a jumping point for certain individuals that realize that, oh my gosh, if I do succeed, it's going to bring a different level of either responsibility, a different level. It's almost like, well, that I would rather stay in neutral than to succeed, because if I succeed, it may put me at a level at which I would then fail, right? So it's not really the success that they're scared of. It's what that success would bring in the situations that it may then put them into, right? So it's just a kind of a thought that I had after our conversation, especially for a tactical athlete. Oh my gosh! Now all of a sudden I'm going to be leading a platoon, or now all of a sudden, like that becomes a completely different ball game.
Yeah, like what I love that point. Like, what's going to happen next? Are
Right.
people going to do this again? What if I
Yeah.
can't do it again?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it was just a fluke. Maybe I just had a really good day on the range. I mean, now all of a sudden, what are they going to put me in the infantry or whatever? I mean, there's a lot of those things.
Maybe I don't want to have tactical
Right.
responsibility, because now I have lives, real lives, not just my own, but others that I have to make some really difficult decisions about. That's heavy. I mean, that could be a heavy situation.
I had a conversation recently talking about like reaction time training, and there's a study that looked at reaction time for special forces soldiers and those that trained mental skills and those that didn't, and the difference was like less than a second, I think. So they were doing a stress shoot, they'd worked out, and they entered a room and they had to identify the correct target. So they had the memory and recall piece, and then they had to engage that target. And the authors talked about how, like, statistically significant, no, real life significance, yes. Where it's like that, the amount of time could be the difference between the person in the room firing first or not getting the opportunity to fire. So yeah, I think like the more you push, the more that's expected. And if you're concerned about repeating those performances, having that quick reaction time outside of training, that's definitely, for me at least, an understandable fear, right? Like I never served, I'm a civilian, but like seeing this stuff, it's like, hey, I get it.
Right.
Oh yeah.
Right. So for our listeners, because I like to do this from time to time, is just give them, the whole idea of this podcast is Mental Advantage Podcast. It's helping people get those systems and strategies they can implement today to make them better versions of themselves. As somebody who helps people deal with that fear of failure, I'm sure a fair amount, are there certain tips that you would have for the person who's listening that maybe their fear of failure is not to the level that somebody who's getting ready to go into combat is, but maybe it's just a fear of failing on that business presentation they have tomorrow? I mean, how do you kind of unpack that for people that might be listening that would like to know how they can start to get themselves overcoming that fear? Yeah,
I think a couple of broad strategies that could be useful. Let's go back to values and beliefs, right? Like do a little digging for yourself, a little reflection, journaling, if you want to do that, and like try to understand what's contributing to this fear. Is it, because oftentimes I've found it's not just a fear of failure, right? Like it's a fear of, like you mentioned, repeating that performance, meeting the new expectations. Is it a belief like I'm not good enough, right? Are you getting into some imposter syndrome or something? So like do a little journaling and reflect on that. And then I think the next strategy is, if you're afraid of failing, what are the behaviors that you would be doing if you were failing, right? Like, let's get it out there, right? Like, what does that look like? And then what does success look like? Because I think y'all mentioned this earlier, like courage isn't the absence of fear. It's like acting in the face of fear, like being regardless. So you can still go in and have a good presentation if you're afraid of failing, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But what are the things that you're going to need to do to be successful? And so identifying those and the strategies that you can use to take those steps. And then the last one, if I could only teach one skill for the rest of my career, taking some diaphragmatic breaths, right? Like, take some breaths. Let's start practicing it now. That way, if your energy and motion is too high, well, let's dial it back a little bit. And then let's focus on our breath and use that to transition to the steps and the strategies that you identified that you want to do. Right?
And that breathing is so critical because it allows you to be back in control, because you have to, when you are conscious of something that you're doing on a very subconscious level, then it gives you that control back. I heard one of our former guests, Brian Kite, talked about fear one time, and he was saying when you really unpack it, it's a lot of times people have this fear of, he said, when you start asking and journaling, whatever the case would be, you find out, well, people are afraid of attempting something and not being successful at moving on to that next step. So if I'm afraid of attempting something and not moving on to that next step, in reality, what I'm really saying is I'm afraid of staying where I am. Because if I don't move to the next step, I'm just staying where I am. So really the fear is it's a fear of staying right where you are. And ever since I heard him say that, I thought, well, it's just a different way of looking at that, but it's so true. A lot of times people's fear is just being stagnant right where they are. Brandon, did you have?
No, I was just thinking, I remember Brian talking about that. So many, what I love that you said, Jay, is that kind of that reset breath. It's that thing that so many people could benefit from. I know it is absolutely the thing that when I'm coaching, my son's 13-year-old, it's almost like you can wash everything out if you'll just take some good cleansing breaths. Whether it's box breathing or there's just so many things there that really kind of help reset you and ground you and get you refocused on what you need to do there. So I'm in agreement with you. I mean, that is like one thing, like, of everything. And it's so easy to apply, right? I mean, that's one of those things that's easy to apply, and there's no reason that you can't do it. So I like that.
Yeah, and it's physiology. I'll share a story. It's funny you bring up like speaking. When I was growing up, I would do extra work in group projects to not have to be the kid that was talking, like in the front of class, right? I was like, that's not me. Now I do that for a living, but I remember early on in my career, I had to go give a presentation to a room, and I was told it would only be a few hundred soldiers only, right? Few hundred tactical athletes. And it turned out to be like 700. And so I'm standing up in front of this room full of 700 people, and I was like, I quit. Like, that's it. That's it for me. It's a wrap. I'm done. I'm out of here.
That's right.
I think one of the things that really interested me in sports psych, or at least kept me like really bought in, is like, I can use this for myself. Let's be selfish a little bit. So I vividly remember standing up there and like taking some deep breaths and being like, okay, what am I here to do today? Like, I'm going to talk about this. Fingers crossed, I know more than they do. Right? I don't know what I'm going to do if they know more than me. And let's just go with it. And so I think, it's kind of funny you bring up speaking, but yeah.
Yep. Breathing is the key. So we're out of time, but I have one final question that I don't think the listeners would let me live down if I didn't ask it, because it's become kind of the thing that we ask everybody. Is, you've had a lot of experience, over a decade of working with athletes and tactical athletes, everything in between. If you could gift, let's say you have I give you the power to just give one mental skill to these athletes that are going to set them up for success, and you give this is theirs to take, and you don't have to develop it anymore. They just have it. What would that one mental skill be that you think would give them the best chance for success?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's what we were talking about. I think it's the ability to breathe. I think it's the ability to breathe, whether things are going well, whether things are not going well, or things are just in the middle, right? Like red, green, or yellow light, doesn't matter. Breathe.
That's it. That's it. Keeps you focused, dialed in. And by the way, Jay, you gave me a new question that people will be hearing is, what is the one skill you would teach for the rest of your life? So I like that. You've already contributed a lot to the Mental Advantage podcast for the future. So, well, listen, man, we can't thank you enough. I know you've got to have a very busy schedule with all of the different things that you're doing, all the different clients and stuff. But, our hats off to Aaron Goodson, who recommended that we reach out to you because you were everything he had said you would be. But we really appreciate you taking the time to join us. And like we, often say, there's so many things we could have got into even further. And, when the time's right, maybe we'll even have you come back if you would be willing to do that at some point down the road and talk a little bit more about some of these things.
I'd love to. I was pumped when I got the invitation. Maybe Aaron and I can come back at the same time.
That would be outstanding. We'll do a whole West Virginia thing. We'll bring Dana Charbonneau back. We'll just do a whole little connection there.
So, Jay, we'll talk offline for sure, because when Auburn and Mississippi State play this year, we'll try to get everybody together.
Yeah, that works for me.
Okay. Yeah, I'm in Nashville, so I can be
That's
down
an easy
there
trip
in
for
no
you.
time.
That's an easy trip for you. So,
well, everyone, Jay Stewart, we thank you, Dr. Stewart, for joining us on this, Wednesday evening, which this show will be aired on Friday morning. So thanks again. We really do appreciate you.
Want to provide feedback or stay up to date with the show? Visit our Instagram page at Mental Advantage Podcast, or you can send us an email at podcast@mentaladvantage.net. To have John Cullen work with you or your team, please write to him at john.cullen@mentaladvantage.net. Thanks for listening to today's episode.